Hello, my name's Tom Bowen. I'm one of the founders of the King Alfred Classical Christian School in Dudley. If you're wondering what a classical Christian school is, then please allow me to introduce Dr. Joe Boot. Joe Boot is the founder of the Ezra Institute for Contemporary Christianity. He's also the founding pastor of the Westminster Chapel, Toronto, and was involved in setting up the Westminster Classical Christian Academy. He's also written about culture and education in his book, The Mission of God. Joe, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Tom. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Joe, I have a few questions that parents often ask, and I'm hoping you'll help us to get a deeper understanding of Christian education and classical Christian education. So, one of the first questions people often ask is, how would you explain classical Christian education to someone who's never heard of it before?
Yeah, well, that's a question that gets asked a lot, especially those who are prospective parents or are interested in a classical Christian school. And because in recent years now, we could probably say that the last 50 or 60 years, they seem new, there's often a sort of a knowledge gap from the name to an understanding of what it's all about. One of the things I often say to people is that a classical Christian education is the kind of education that your grandma or your great-grandma received if she went to grammar school. You know, it was something that was common within the Western world and has been central to the Western tradition of a liberal arts education. So it was something that was familiar, very familiar to previous generations. And so it's a good way of thinking about it, actually, initially, is just to say it's the sort of education that many of your grandparents or great-grandparents would have received. And if you think about the wonderful letters that your grandparents or great-grandparents used to write with a fountain pen, and the handwriting, the spelling, I still remember the kinds of letters that my grandmother used to write. Really, just on a high school education, it really demonstrates or illustrates straight away some of the benefits of a classical Christian education. So what can we say beyond that? What was it like to have a classical Christian education? Of course, what we're talking about and what you're setting up there in Dudley, what I've set up in Toronto, in Canada, at Westminster, lays the emphasis on the Christian, but the pedagogy, that's the method of teaching, is classical. So what do we mean by that? That's probably the second most important thing to say. Well, the classical method follows what we might simply call the grammar, logic, rhetoric phase or template in education. And really that simply means it follows the natural development of a child. It's not really more complicated than that. Grammar, logic, rhetoric. The grammar stage is where you're basically learning by rote and repetition the rules. So, you know, children, small children, they love to sing, they love to memorize, they love to go over things. You know, when we've got little ones, they say again, you know, I want to watch it again, I want to do it again. Well, it's the same with education. The grammar stage is where the basic rules, the fundamentals, the foundations in especially in language, in English, beginning with also with a Latin foundation that provides the foundation for all the Romance languages. And so English and of course mathematics. So you're putting the basic foundations in place. That's the grammar phase. It's about learning to love learning and repetition and putting those foundations in. The grammar phase, so that's the first phase. The second stage is the logic phase, and that's where you start making connections between the subjects. Children, once they get past that memorization phase, start asking questions. And as you're teaching the various subjects, they begin to ask really meaningful questions about their subject. And so you start to help them become discriminating, analyzing, compartmentalizing, understanding the various categories and bringing the relationships between those areas together. And then the final phase, which a student enters into in their natural development as a young person, is the rhetoric phase. And that's all about communication. So that's just about how you write and how you speak. How do you communicate what you've learned? So you learn the basic tools, you learn how to relate to various subjects, and then you learn to really effectively communicate. So that's the sort of basic template of a classical education. And so that's the pedagogy, that's the method of teaching. And then the curriculum is based around 3 phases, basically: the ancient, the medieval, and the modern. So that's a simple way in which we break up the curriculum, is around what was ancient, and that would be, of course, in world history, but with a particular focus on the Western tradition in a classical Christian education, going back to the ancient Greeks. The medieval world, what we call the Middle Ages, right through to the High Middle Ages, and then the modern period. And of course, the goal in all of that is to develop critical thinking, critical awareness, so that people have a sense of the spread of history and culture, and the student begins to learn that, grapple with that. And so the interesting thing is, when you're looking at, say, ancient ideas in mathematics or in ancient issues in language, you might be focused on a particular area or culture. You're looking at the same subject in history, in geography, and so on. So you try and give the child a sense of how people were grappling with the subject matter in each of those eras. So it's very simple to remember. Grammar, logic, rhetoric, ancient, medieval, modern is the basic essential template of a classical Christian education. And beyond that, in terms of answering the question of how would you explain beyond those very simple basics to somebody, well, it's aiming, a classical Christian education is aiming at developing a mature, a competent, a well-rounded student who's able to think critically and is interested in advancing the kingdom of God by contributing meaningfully to society and to culture. And so what's really happening in a classical Christian education is there is an intentional passing on of the cultural inheritance, really, of the West, of the Christian West, of Christendom, of Christian civilization, so that you're giving the child, especially in an age and in a time where we have lost a sense of identity and of meaning, of cultural identity and meaning, you're helping give that child a sense of purpose, sense of meaning, a sense of pride, and a desire for service. Now, to clear up one misunderstanding before you move on to the next question, what we're not doing in a classical Christian education is romanticizing or sort of lionizing, idealizing the classical world. The classical world was in many respects a very cruel place. And in fact, it's very difficult to even put into words the cruelty and the sometimes the sheer barbarism of the Greco-Roman world. It's very difficult to fully put into words. So what we're not doing is, people hear classical education, they think of a sort of an elitist focus on the classical world, and that the sole goal is to sort of recover classical authors. Well, of course, there is reading of some of the classical authors, but the goal actually of a classical Christian education is to bring to bear the Christian faith, the word of God, in a formative and critical manner on the entirety of our cultural and religious heritage. So you're not just learning the Western tradition in the midst of your understanding and learning about world history. You're particularly reflecting on how would a Christian critique and reflect on what was happening in the ancient, medieval, and the modern world. So you're passing on that inheritance, but it's also a Christian critique of history, science, and culture in every age. So the elevator pitch is, it's the kind of education your grandmother or great-grandmother had when she was at grammar school: grammar, logic, rhetoric, ancient, medieval, modern, and a well-rounded, mature student with purpose, meaning, and identity, who has an ability to step out into culture and lead.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you talk about the stages of learning. I've recently been listening to the wartime speeches of Winston Churchill, and obviously this is the kind of education that he would have had.
Exactly.
And all his peers would have had. And in his speeches, he often quotes people from history like Alexander the Great, for instance. And for him to make that point, there has to be a common understanding amongst his peers that everyone is grounded and understands this classical tradition. Otherwise, it would be pointless to raise up a character like Alexander the Great if other people didn't know who he was.
Yes.
And then also the logic stage. Winston Churchill was thinking critically, often going against the grain of public consensus. He was thinking for himself about what was happening in Europe at the time. And then to raise awareness, which leads into the final stage, the rhetoric stage, he had to use all his skills as an orator to persuade people about what was happening in Europe, even though I think people would have rather have turned a blind eye.
Yes.
So,
I think Winston Churchill is actually, I'm glad you've mentioned him. I didn't know you were going to do that, but that's actually a very, very good illustration because, Winston Churchill has been voted repeatedly greatest Briton, and is still, respected and highly regarded in the United Kingdom, as he should be. And to reflect on what it took to produce a man like Winston Churchill, and it's worth mentioning that Winston wasn't a brilliant student. He did okay in school, but he wasn't a brilliant student. But he was disciplined and motivated. And of course, I think he won a Nobel Prize for Literature in the end for his history of the English-speaking peoples. He was a painter. He was also a bricklayer. He was prepared through his education in a multiplicity of ways. And the fact that he understood and recognized these allusions to the history of the West not only informed some of the references to the classical authors in his speeches that gave a certain power to his rhetoric. And don't forget, that was a rhetoric that was moving for the average working class person also in England, who was huddled around the radio at home or in the pub listening to his speech. They were stirred and moved by the way in which Winston had understood through one of his teachers, who he often speaks about, learn to write, learn to use good grammar, and then his depth of reading. And some of that was his self-discipline. I mean, in one of his periods in the early on in his career in the military, he asked his mother to send him all kinds of classical authors and all kinds of philosophers and historical works, which he hadn't read, which he wanted to read and wanted to get through. And that really, shows that actually part of having a classical education, getting that foundation in, is you become a lifelong learner. And then you can process this material, for yourself. And so it actually informed his battle strategy, because he knew what had happened in the history of war within Europe. And that was actually influencing him as he thought about how to win the war as well. So that's a really good illustration of maybe a question for later on, actually one of the values of a classical education, a classical Christian education.